And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them. Yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
As always, thanks for tuning into the podcast. My name is Drew Perkins, and I am the Director of Professional Development here at TeachThought. And a couple housekeeping announcements that I wanted to share. First, I hope everyone listening is taking care of themselves, both emotionally and physically, as we go through unprecedented times. And some of that can be stressful just personally, certainly, as you think about the constant worry of getting sick, but also some of the logistics and pieces of being an educator in online environments. So with that in mind, we hope that the resources and blog pieces that we share and have are helpful. But I'm now happy to confirm that we are tentatively, at least, going to be hosting an online discussion forum, conversation forum on inquiry teaching in uncertain times. The date and time looks to be Wednesday, April 15th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And involved in that will be Sarah Westbrook from the Right Question Institute, Warren Berger, who is the author of A More Beautiful Question, the Book of Beautiful Questions, and an upcoming book about beautiful questions in the classroom. And myself, I'll be sort of hosting and emceeing as we talk about the why, the what if, and the how. Why is inquiry teaching so important? What if it's maybe the most important thing that we need to be focusing on now? And how do we do that in an online format and online environment? So hopefully you can tune in. You can check out our social media channels and our website, wegrowteachers.com, for details on how to register for that. That's not up probably by the time that this podcast is published, but it will be very soon. And again, that's Wednesday, April 15th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And it will be free to register and join. I also wanted to mention that we have now placed on our website a page with online workshops, because we anticipate that schools and teachers will at some point need to very likely be shifting their professional development to online environments as opposed to face-to-face. Hopefully we can get back to face-to-face sooner rather than later, but if and when you are ready to look at shifting your professional development needs to an online environment, feel free to jump on over to wegrowteachers.com. You'll see along the top a menu item called Online Workshops, and we have several pieces on offer there on project-based learning and leadership project-based learning and creating a culture of inquiry, all of which will be available as public registration for teachers who want to sign up individually, and we will be limiting those to 8 participants only. But also, we will have those available for school cohort groups. And if you're interested in a cohort group for your school, feel free to reach out. And what we will do is personalize the dates and the scope and the way that that looks to meet your needs specifically. So you may not be ready for quite some time to engage in more traditional professional learning to grow your craft. But if and when you are ready, we do hope that those things are helpful. In this podcast episode, I spoke with Reid Nicewonder, who has a YouTube channel and social media outlets that is called Cordial Curiosity. And what he does is he engages in what is called street epistemology, which is really helping people discover or uncover their truths and their beliefs in short conversations that are sort of random on the street, and he films them and puts them out on YouTube and some of the social media pieces. So the inquiry piece is what I was really most interested in, because as listeners, I'm sure you're familiar with our affinity for inquiry as a really powerful piece of teaching and learning. So we talked about how he leans into the reliability of the methods and what those methods are. Talked about why it's important for people to be able to be really good critical thinkers in figuring out what they believe. and touched on the role of education, the role of perhaps family and upbringing. We talked about how we might criticize or think about the work of social justice on the left, as well as some of the ideologies or pieces that we see on the right, including President Trump, and the different kinds of questions that one might ask, like disconfirmation questions and the outsider test questions and things like that. So again, really a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and the idea of inquiry. So as teachers, I hope you find it helpful in the pursuit of constructivist and making meaning in your classrooms. Reid, welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on, as we are going to talk about one of my most favorite things in the world, and something that you have engaged in your work with Cordial Curiosity, and we'll talk about that, but some other pieces around what you call street epistemology. But the idea of inquiry and questions, and I love beautiful questions, and the work that we do with teachers is all focused on that, of course. But I want to give our listeners an opportunity to learn a little bit more about you, and I guess how you came to the work that you're doing with epistemology, and I guess maybe that journey, so they have some context.
Sure thing. Yeah, thanks, Drew. Glad to be here. A little background on me. I have a YouTube channel now called Cordial Curiosity, where I go out in public and just sit there with a table and a couple GoPros and microphones and let people come up to me, and I have conversations with them where I mainly just ask questions, try to use this conversational method called street epistemology. And my background of how I got into that, I've been into it probably since 2014, 2015. There was a book originally that came out in 2013 from Dr. Peter Boghossian, and then a whole community started trying to practice this thing called street epistemology, which came from that book. And over the years, we've refined it, we've improved it. I started going out in public around mid-2016, then I started my YouTube channel late 2016.
Okay, and listeners might be familiar with Peter's work, and I know you are very familiar with it from the two podcasts I've done with James Lindsay, as they co-wrote, I think just the two of them co-wrote How to Have Impossible Conversations, which is, I would recommend that book as well. Helen wasn't part of that, was she? It was just James and Peter?
Yeah, just James and Peter.
Yeah. And certainly, before we went live, I was telling you I was listening to a discussion that you and Peter and some other folks in the street epistemology, I guess, community were having about that book, and it's interesting to come back and reflect, and I want to sort of flag that and maybe talk about it a little bit later or throughout. But what I guess let's define for listeners, and most of our listeners are, as best we can tell, educators, and when we think about construction of meaning and understanding and knowledge, I think inquiry is a big piece of it, and epistemology is certainly, if not directly related, at least tangentially related. So how do you define street epistemology?
Sure. There's a few different definitions we use. It's the application of epistemology, which is the study of knowledge, the philosophical branch of academia called epistemology, study of knowledge. Outside of formal academic contexts, we're not philosophers, we're not experts in epistemology, but we're trying to apply, the core principles of epistemology outside of academic contexts. It's like a fun and effective way to talk to people about what's really true. But really, it's a conversational tool that helps people reflect on the reliability of the methods they use to arrive at their deeply held beliefs.
So the things that you do, the things that I've seen, and I think there's some different versions of it where you've had commentary on them, but you try to paint a picture for listeners, and I definitely recommend, I've tweeted or retweeted or some things like that, a sort of hashtag question porn, because I think it's kind of a fun way to think about the inquiry process. But you're sitting at a little table in various public settings, and you normally reside in Los Angeles, so most of those are happening in Los Angeles, I'm assuming, and random people just come up and you film it and you record the audio and you let them sort of dictate what they want to talk about, right?
Right. I usually go out to a public park or a college campus, sit down at the table, have a little sign with a few broad discussion questions, and random people can come down and sit down, and then I ask them to pick a belief they have, something ideally they really think is true, something that maybe they use to act upon regularly, something that is core to their being, what they do. And then I try to understand what they believe, why, and how they know their whys are good reasons.
Right. And I've watched these, and you can see that you have, I think, a little whiteboard and a little timer, and you're using some of those tools. What's the purpose of the whiteboard and the timer, or how do those become involved?
Sure. The timer, I have a little sign on my table that says 5-minute interviews. So I like to, respect people's time, but most of the time it goes over because people are usually enjoying the conversation. And the whiteboard I use to put up I have little Post-it notes of different colors. I usually put the main topic question we're thinking about on the table and on the whiteboard. And then if we get into a more complex topic, I can use other Post-it notes to put down the reasons, and it's just a good way to track things. And street epistemology, you don't have to go out in public and record interviews. It's just a way of having conversations. You don't have to record it, go out on the streets, go out and into public and do this. It's just a way of having conversations. But some of us like to record it and show our conversations that way, get feedback.
Yeah. Well, I think it's helpful for teachers. I think I can imagine it would be helpful for teachers to think about the inquiry process just in general. And certainly, I don't think we want to engage students in the same way necessarily, although maybe at times. Why are you so passionate about this? And how did you? I mean, why are you so spending so much time doing it? Why is it so important?
That's a big question. I think a couple goals. It relates to just making the world a better place. There's, broadly speaking, we have like two ways of solving problems, disagreements. There's like violence or conversation. We don't want violence, so ideally, the better the conversations we have, the more likely it is we'll be able to solve shared problems and problems that we disagree with the solutions with. So it's really about figuring out how to help people reflect on what they know so that we can figure out what's true and apply what's true to solve problems in society.
Right. And listeners of the podcast to be familiar with my passion for trying to have, being comfortable with uncomfortable conversations and trying to overcome some of the polarization pieces, as you mentioned. So when we have conflict, how do we work through it and how do we talk through it, and what are some of the ways? Do you feel like the people that engage with you in those sessions, do they come away with, they certainly, the ones that I've seen, they've come away with either a more or less concrete foundation or understanding of their beliefs, sometimes less, sometimes it exposes some shakiness there, and those are maybe some of the more fun ones to watch. I don't know if they're the more fun ones to engage with, but do you feel like they come away with that takeaway that you're after with sort of the reliability of the methods?
I think so. That happens pretty often. Most of the time, people leave with, a smile and a handshake, being appreciative of the conversation, of having had the conversation. Very rarely, virtually never, people get upset or get mad or storm off. It's usually very cordial, and that's how I like it to be. Sometimes people reduce their confidence. We use this confidence scale. I have a little meter that I made for my table, and people start off with a certain confidence amount. Sometimes that changes by the end. Sometimes they increase. Sometimes they decrease. it's not so much trying to get people to change their mind on specific topics to go to a specific position. It's about reflecting on the way we come to beliefs in general and the quality of our methods to get there.
Right. So what are those methods? Like when you talk about the reliability of the methods, what are the methods that we should be using to formulate our beliefs?
Yeah, there's like two parts of this. There's the skill set of like inquiry analysis and inference. That's usually a big part of critical thinking. But there's also this separate part of just having a certain attitude, certain ways of feeling about conversation and questions. At bottom, you want to have the attitude of being open to being wrong, being willing to revise your beliefs. Without that, all the other stuff is kind of moot. So if you have that, that's what we try to model in the conversation at core, is having those attitudes. But the methods themselves, it's really about, there's a few things. We try to, the skeleton of the conversation is like a Socratic method type of thing, where we pick a belief and then we wonder about a reason, a way of coming to that belief. And then we try to identify, is this reason a good reason? Then we ask questions about that reason. A couple kinds of questions is called disconfirmation questions, which is under what conditions could this belief be false? What reason could you give that would imply that it was not true or less likely to be true? That's one type of test, one type of question. Another is outsider test questions, which is if someone else believes something different, but in like a similar category of belief and use the same method, how could an outsider seeing both of you, one person believing X using method A, one person believing Y using method A, how could someone outside tell which one was more accurate in their beliefs? That type of thing.
Right. So the attitude piece there in education, and I would say outside of education, I would say lots of times are synonymous with mindset and maybe even a growth mindset, although I don't know that exactly fits. But, you know, the idea, and I've said this before in the podcast, the idea of trying to figure out where I'm wrong as opposed to trying to figure out where I'm right and trying to convince other people that I'm right. And that mindset of being open, matter of fact, welcoming, trying to be, I want to be wrong for as long or as short a time as possible. And I certainly don't want to be wrong. I want to be right more than I'm wrong, certainly. But the mindset that I'm constantly testing where I am right and where I'm wrong instead of trying to confirm that I'm right. And I think that we see that certainly as people consume media and, lots of the beliefs that get into some of the things that are happening on the left and the right. I don't know how you feel, or I'm wondering how you feel about the way that plays out or is playing out on the left and the right, or if you have any particular thoughts on that.
Just how the left and right talk to each other these days.
Well, so let me add some filler details here. So I've sort of felt like as we consume media and are trying to navigate the world in which we live, it feels like that there are two separate, I don't want to say parallel, but sort of pseudo-parallel realities going on, which is about the epistemology, right? That this is my reality, that's your reality, and there's a sort of a postmodern version or lens by which that reality is being constructed. And the media that we see, whether it's social media or cable news and Fox and MSNBC or whatever the case may be, that people are so sure of who they support and what they believe and their position, but that the people on the right and the people on the left and I use those terms loosely because maybe it's extreme, maybe it's not extreme, but they have a different version of what the world, what is actually happening in the world. So not necessarily, I mean, it certainly affects how they interact and how they talk, but it's also affecting their actions, the coronavirus being, I think, a good example, right? So there's lots of stories and certainly lots of evidence of, let's say, Fox News pushing out stories originally that the coronavirus was not a big deal, and thus lots of those folks who feel like that's part of their that's the reality. They just went about their business as though it was no big deal. And of course, there's some ramifications there. And I think there are some versions, some examples of that on the left. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, this is very complex. Like with the coronavirus stuff, the media has been very critical of Trump, and obviously for good reason. And people on the right have just been inundated with that for years. So when they start criticizing him about this new thing, they might not take it as seriously because they just see them as just purely antagonistic, not really caring about the truth so much. Maybe it's just a way to criticize him, make him less likely to be reelected. But this is a hard thing. Like, people on the right started waking up once he started doing his press conferences and getting doctors out there. And there's just this tribal way of thinking. If my team is threatened by something, there's just a bias there of not wanting to take it seriously, not wanting to think it's true, because if it is true, that would be a bad thing for my tribe. So that's just a thing that gets in the way of clear thinking, this tribal bias thing.
Right. Yeah, the idea that we have the sides, and I know you're familiar with Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff's book Coddling the American Mind, and some of those great untruths, and the us versus them, good versus evil thing, and navigating that. So I'm curious personally, how do you navigate media and the news? What are your habits or your processes or methods for navigating that, if you feel any of them are particularly useful, because it is so hard?
It is hard. I try to follow people from both sides on social media, on YouTube, and I try to just consume, not all the time, but when major things happen, just getting both perspectives, both sides, and then trying to compare and contrast what couldn't be true. If someone says this to the other side, bring in more information that would have hurt the other side, just to get a more full picture. Sometimes on Twitter, an event happens and I'm scrolling through the timeline, and yeah, it is like that, two alternate realities happening at the same time. So it's hard to get reality straight at those times.
Yeah. How did you get into, or let me rephrase that, how did you learn the methods and the inquiry pieces that you use in this process? Well,
Peter Boghossian's first book came out in late 2013, but I didn't really think about it too much until January of 2015, when I found this interesting person on YouTube called Anthony Magnabosco, who was going out and recording street epistemology conversations in San Antonio, and those were fascinating. That was the first time I really saw it in practice being used, and people were being reflective, being more open. It was not a debate. People weren't shouting at each other. It was just a very interesting thing, a breath of fresh air. And over the years, since 2015, he's been doing more stuff, experimenting. Other people have joined doing recorded interviews, and we just learn from each other. So we've just recorded our conversations, watched ourselves back. That's been a huge thing. Learning how we say certain things, what we look like when we say certain things, ask questions, and it's been very helpful doing that.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with Anthony, or at least I don't think I am by his name. I'll have to make sure put him in the show notes and links and that kind of thing.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and again, maybe I was, or maybe I am, and I'm just not recognizing his name. The street epistemology, especially the videos, are pretty new to me, and I think yours was the first one that I'd seen, and then I have seen some others, and again, it may be Anthony's that I've seen, and I just don't remember it exactly. What was it like? Do you remember the first time you went out and did this in person?
I did. The first time I did at a LA Times Festival of Books. It was pretty crowded. I only had a few conversations, but for the first time going out solo, I went to Griffith Park, just below the Griffith Observatory, on a hiking trail there, set up my table and GoPros and really crappy audio with the mic that I'm using right now. It's not the best mic to go outside with.
Uh-huh.
And it was pretty nerve-wracking, but people were willing to sit down. It was interesting. I had a little sign that says, "What do you believe in and why?" 5-minute interviews. And it was really cool. People wanted to chat. It was nice.
Yeah. Was there a sense of nervousness, or, I mean, certainly it's sort of like looking back at your high school pictures or videos or something and seeing it and going, wow, I wish there wasn't, sort of archival evidence of that. Was there any reflection on that?
There was. I was much more nervous at the beginning, much more timid. Sometimes I would feel uncomfortable asking a certain question or pushing or going too far. And sometimes I would just, as Peter Boghossian says in his new book, sending a message. I would do that sometimes. It's not a good thing to do. So, yeah, lots of stuff to criticize early on.
Mm-hmm. So let's pull on that thread a little bit here when you say sending a message, because it gets back to some of the impossible conversation pieces that I think is a really important piece. So you're having conversations with cordial curiosity, but they're not really the same kinds of conversations that lots of people have, right? You're sort of directing the conversation with your questions. And there are lots of conversations, especially in our polarization landscape, that we are trying to have that aren't exactly that. So what is that when you say sending a message? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, in general, conversation, just as something humans do, is a way to signal how smart you are, how part of the team you are. And that's just how usual conversations go. So most people are just waiting for someone to shut up so that you can start talking and saying what you think, telling them what's the case, what do you think are good facts that they should adopt. That's the default usually for human conversation. But with SE, you really try to avoid that. You want to make it all about the person you're talking to, mainly listening, virtually not saying anything except for questions. And not sending a message means do not give them any facts, avoid facts. Facts don't work for changing minds, especially with things that are deeply tied to people's identity or morality. Tons of evidence for that. So just listen, ask questions, and it's a very different type of conversation than usual.
Do you get accused of, in your sort of regular conversations or interactions, do you get the sort of accusation that you lack empathy? Because I get that sometimes, and I think I put it in the sort of context of the rational emotional spectrum, and I'm certainly much more rational logical than I am emotional, and I recognize that. And I've even said, if you're coming to me for emotional, empathy kind of thing, it's not that I'm lacking empathy. It's just not my strong suit in how I operate and deal with things and that kind of piece. But do you get that much?
Yeah, a lot of my friends in the SE community just call me like a robot, which I can understand completely. I try to, there's a chapter in the book about dealing with anger, and it's really just dealing with any type of emotion that will get in the way that could evoke a defensive posture in the other person. So ideally just be calm, cool, and collected. It'd be nice if I was more jovial or charismatic, but that's just not part of my personality. So I deal with what I can.
So what are your like Thanksgiving dinner conversations like, and any sort of experience or stories from those kinds of conversations where they've gone well or badly, or do you try to avoid some of those, or maybe a better question, when do you try to avoid those kinds of conversations that are likely wrought with conflict or potential conflict?
Yeah, I rarely talk with family and friends with street epistemology because they usually know me, and it's just there's a lot of background knowledge there. And this is something I've just recently started taking up with in the past few years. So it probably would be a very shocking difference in terms of the way I talk with people, because I'm usually an introvert and don't talk that much anyway. But with this, I can just talk with strangers, and I can skip the small talk and get straight to deep discussions, deep conversations. So that's the advantage of it, going out in public and doing it. But with family and friends, I rarely do it.
Right. So what are some of the, I guess, best stories or highlights, or I don't know how many of these conversations you've had. I would imagine hundreds or maybe 1,000. I don't know if you have a number, if any of the highlights that are worth sharing that are like, wow, that really went sideways, or that really ended up great, or something like that.
Yeah, I'm probably hitting maybe close to 1,000, over 1,000 at this point. I tried to go out once or twice a week since mid-2016, and it's been a ride. Some highlights, I guess. I've been to a few conventions besides going out to my usual spot at the park or on college campus. I went to VidCon a few years ago, had a really great conversation with a young woman called Tia. That was probably one of my best conversations, because it pretty much sticks straight to the textbook of what you're supposed to do with SE. And Tia was super honest and, kept her answers short. So it was just perfect, really, for me. And other good conversations. And there was this guy called Dominique who I spoke with at the trail. That was a good conversation. He was super nice. And I've been to recently, I started out talking more about religion and spirituality, but over the past year, I've tried to focus more on politics and culture, social justice, trying to get that stuff. And I went to CPAC and Politicon in the past 6 months. Those are political conventions, and those conversations are a little bit harder. It's different. People have, solid evidence, or just at least reasons that tie to reality, and it's just hard to get into people's epistemology because it's usually reason and evidence. But people are usually still very reluctant to change their mind, change their confidence. So it's similar but a little different.
Well, that's interesting. So the political ideology is maybe more concrete or more solidified than, say, religion?
Yeah, with religion, you can get into contradictory or unreliable epistemology fairly quickly, maybe in 10 minutes. But with politics, it gets down to just, certain policies are based on this stat or this evidence, and I don't know hardly anything about those things. So we just got to think of potential disconfirmation criteria that, if true, would shift their confidence, how we would know what sources are reliable. It doesn't get deep into the epistemology as much.
Well, it's an interesting thing to notice. So you said you don't know as much about the I guess the knowledge base that they might be using as foundations for their belief system and their ideology, and that as a teacher. So one of the pieces that I think is really important is inquiry, but there's in constructivist education, I don't know how much you know about pedagogy or teaching and learning and that kind of thing, but there's sort of a very didactic, very traditional method, which some people would say more old school, teachers delivering and students are consuming, and there's not a whole lot of deeper thinking and learning. And the other side of that, or maybe the other side of that spectrum, as it were, is more constructivist and inquiry-based. And one of the criticisms is a lack of attention to knowledge, which I think is a rightful criticism. But, and I'm curious, when you think about critical thinking and inquiry, if you have a sense or how you feel about the idea that teachers can't teach critical thinking and the importance of knowledge in that process. I think that sort of highlights when you're talking about the political realm versus some of the other realms, which you do have more knowledge. And I think we have to, as teachers in constructivist settings, really be clear that we're trying to pull out knowledge from people and help them create meaning and understanding. And some of the pieces, the things that you engage with are helpful tools, but that knowledge without inquiry is really not particularly all that useful. So, and I asked several questions in there. I don't know if you take your pick.
Yeah, I think knowledge is a big part of critical thinking, having just a type of argument matrix, just being able to have in the back of your mind, what are the reasons for this, what are the reasons against this, and just having that there as background knowledge. It's good to help ask as confirmation questions. If people can't think of any themselves, you can possibly give a hypothetical scenario, and that requires background knowledge. So I think it's a big part of it.
Would you have an intuition about whether someone can teach critical thinking?
Without background knowledge or with it?
Either way. I mean, just the process, because one of the criticisms, or some people would say, critical thinking is a nonsense concept that you can't teach, that it's not something that you can teach, which I would disagree with, but I don't know what your intuition is there.
I think it's definitely teachable. It's really, it's a half attitude, half skill set, and you just need to practice it, work with examples, figuring out a question you're wondering about, figuring out types of evidence or reasons people would give, analyzing if those reasons make a good argument. Do the premises relate? Is it valid, sound, that type of thing? That's just a core part of it. I think it's definitely teachable.
So there's two pieces there, sort of the skill, but also a mindset. And I want to pull on a couple threads in how you develop that skill, and maybe more importantly, the mindset. One, which is your educational experience, but also your home environment and, parents and the people that you grew up with and how they may have affected that. And you can talk about either one of those, but I'd like to talk about both of them.
Sure. I guess growing up, I wasn't the best student, maybe, B's on average. But I went to private high school. It was like a college preparatory boarding school. Learned a lot there. But getting into college, it just didn't. It was a public college at UCF. I was mainly just making short films and movies with my friends. I went to film school. So it wasn't until like after college I got into this critical thinking stuff. I found, Reddit, and found YouTube and just saw, videos on skepticism. So that got me into it first. And then I got into, after Peter Boghossian's book and watching Anthony's videos, I got into it more. And I've just been reading mainly, stuff like Jonathan Haidt, James Lindsay, Peter Boghossian, stuff like that. So it's been mainly an after college type of project for me.
Do you think your upbringing and your parents sort of set the stage for that? And does it feel like there's a sort of cognitive development that happens, a maturity that happens that makes one? I mean, certainly the upbringing and sort of the nurture part of that, and perhaps some of the nature. I would think my intuition would be that it would set one up for being open to the processes and the thinking and stuff that we're talking about. But similar to you, I remember sort of becoming an adult, and throughout my adulthood, definitely thinking about these kinds of things certainly much differently. And we can easily blame school in the way that school is done, but I'm not sure that that's not a bit of a straw man, and how that feels. What's your intuition about the role of school in how and the sort of cognitive development and maturity, and when you were sort of ready for this kind of thing?
Yeah, I would say my schooling completely failed to instill me with the values and skill sets I have related to street epistemology. That was just something that was self-taught afterwards. Ideally, this should start, third grade or something, and keep it in everything, every class. Keep that type of attitude, be willing to question, having the teacher be willing to say, I don't know. When they get asked a question, don't pretend to know what you don't know. Model that throughout the entire education process. That would probably help a lot.
Right. And what about your upbringing and the role that they may have played, or do you feel like that they had a similar mindset, your parents or the folks that you grew up with?
Not at all. No.
Interesting. Are you able to have, well, you said you don't really have a lot of those kinds of conversations with your family, but are there ideological differences that you might have with your parents that are points of contention?
Yeah, I left home at like 13 to go to boarding school and then went to college. So it's pretty rare I am like in the presence of my parents or brother, unless it's like a holiday or something or vacation. And I try not to, bog them down with religion or politics conversations. And it's only been the past few years that I've been into this. So I haven't had the opportunity, but if I do, I will let you know.
Well, let's touch back into the social justice piece you mentioned, and what are the ways in which you feel like the epistemology as it relates to social justice is either really valid or problematic?
Yeah, there's this general concept of social justice, which is a good thing, but there's this totally different way of conceptualizing social justice, which James Lindsay calls critical social justice. And the critical doesn't mean critical thinking, it means critical theory, which is an academic, way of analyzing stuff, mainly just to problematize different things, figuring out what's wrong with something. You don't necessarily have to understand what's true, just what's wrong with whatever project is happening and why certain outcomes are the way they are, assuming the outcomes are based on some type of discrimination or bigotry, oppression. And tied into that with critical social justice is this postmodern type of thing, which is melded into critical theory. And it's just a whole different way of thinking. It's a whole different mindset. It absolutely rejects science and evidence and objectivity, trying to appeal to, the evidence outside of people's personal experience. It tries to make personal identity absolute, that's the core authority of what's true.
So what's the problem with that?
The problem with that is reality always bats last. So if we try to put into place some type of policy that does not take into account reality to its fullest extent, we will suffer because reality will eventually come into play, and that's not going to be a good thing for us when that happens. Right.
Are there, in your conversations that you're having in those public conversations, is there more folks who are sort of engaged in the critical social justice piece that will happen to engage with you, or is there a fair balance, or how do those things play out when you have those conversations, assuming you do?
I've been trying to have those conversations, and I've gotten a few bites at the college campus in UCLA. I've started going there in January of this year, but I haven't had a full really conversation with them yet, and it's really rare to have them sit down and talk with you, because another part of their ideology is conversation, language, like the way you talk about things. They think just perpetuates oppression, perpetuates white supremacy. If you have conversations that are questioning certain things, that's just bad for marginalized groups in general. Don't talk about it, just censor. So it's very rare to have these types of conversations. But Anthony Magnabosco released 2 videos, his latest 2, and he's going to have another one this Thursday, his 3rd conversation with someone who is deeply into this, and I highly recommend watching those videos.
Is this the one, and maybe this is, I have seen him, he's on a college campus, and I've seen parts 1, and I think parts 2, where they start talking about how many, his little prop, I think, is a little thing of Tic Tacs, and he's saying, the truth of how many are in this. Is that Anthony?
That's Anthony, yep.
Okay, yeah.
He talks with someone named Vanessa about equity and epistemic justice.
Yeah.
Yeah, just search for that.
Yeah, well, if you don't mind, because I'm guessing you can probably do a much better job of sort of summarizing those parts 1 and parts 2. What are the gist of those, and what do you see as the issues there?
The issue comes down fundamentally to the rejection of truth and reality, and superseding that with personal experience and identity politics. He was talking with Vanessa about epistemic justice, and she brought up an example of, certain Pueblo Native Americans. They have these Kachina dolls that they think are ancestors, literal ancestors, and they think putting those Kachina dolls in museums is a type of exoticization, a way to trap literal ancestors in museums just for our exoticization, our way of just oppressing further this tribe, this different epistemology, this different marginalized group, Native American, indigenous people. So she's saying that's just, they have a totally different way of thinking. And Anthony brought in his Tic Tacs, trying to test this way of thinking. If one tribe thought the Tic Tacs were odd, and another tribe thought the Tic Tacs were even, could they both be right? Or is someone at least mistaken? And she said, yeah, they could both be right. That's not how, she doesn't like truth. It's crazy.
Right. Yeah, it was, so the thinking is that you can make your own truth, and there might be different ways to count the number of Tic Tacs in there, lumping them together, or the size of them, or something. I don't know exactly how she made it. But as I think about the epistemology, and again, coming back to the media and some of the pieces that we think about ideologically with how we vote and the sort of tribe that we're in or that we're identifying with, the epistemology, and I find it to be sort of a crisis that we have with our media, because we are at the point now that the confidence in media and the truth that they are telling, or the agenda or messaging that they're trying to potentially push, or we're unsure, the underpinnings of what we believe in journalism are really shaky at this point, and it's so hard to, it's a really hard landscape to navigate. And I don't know that that's necessarily, I mean, that's not necessarily postmodern. Do you see some of that same logical error thinking on the right when you talk with those folks?
Sometimes, yeah. James Lindsay calls Trump a postmodern president. Like, he cares more about the narrative and the media than, actual facts and policy. He cares deeply about his reputation, and it's just very narcissistic, and doesn't think about evidence at all, really. It's mainly about perception and what people are persuaded with, and through narrative, and that narrative is perpetuated through the media. He's very concerned about fake news, trying to delegitimize our institutions of journalism. And they have been used the media as a new competition now. Everyone has a voice. Anyone can make a podcast or put out a YouTube channel. And the medium is kind of the message. We had a few, news organizations in the 50s, 60s, but now over time there's cable news, and there's just all these different websites. There's just a vast range of information out there, and we just need to upgrade our sense-making capabilities and get better at, sense-making in general as a culture.
Yeah, that's the one of the reasons why I really think we need to make a transformation in how we do teaching and learning, in so far as that we are helping students to be better askers of questions, and identifying in the most simple way is what do I need to know in order to answer this question? What do I need to know and learn and do? And identifying that, because in so many cases what happens is teachers are supplying the list of things that they're supposed to know, and so there's this lack of idea or sense making that you're talking about, critical thinking. And I also think that it's not particularly common in our homes and with our parents, right? So the typical question that we ask students when they, kids when they come back from school is, how was your day, or what did you learn in school? And they'll say fine or nothing or something like that. And I sort of joke around when I work with teachers and say, look, I ask my daughters when they come home from school, said, how was your day? And they'll say either great or it stunk, or some description there. And then my follow-up question is, what made it great? Or what was so great about it, or what was bad about it? Essentially, what's the evidence that you have for your claim? And of course, my daughters sometimes, bristle at that, like, God, stop, Dad. I just want to say hi and move on with my day. But then there's also a mindset piece that I think teachers and parents can lean into in trying to get students or kids to not only ask why, but to offer a hypothesis and then test it to see if they're right. And I don't know if that resonates or feels similar to how you're operating in the world, especially with street epistemology.
Yeah, I try to go out my life being open to being wrong, and if I catch myself getting angry at certain things, that's kind of a red flag. So I try to think of ways I could be mistaken, what could be the case that would cause me to revise my belief. That's hard to do usually by yourself. Ideally, you want to have conversations with people who disagree with you. And that's what I try to do by doing street epistemology. But you could do that just in your usual social media life, but it's hard.
Yeah, no doubt. So what are the questions that people should be asking about social justice, for example? Like, what are the most important questions people should be really thinking about and considering and I'm not saying critical social justice, but social justice in general. And if you'd like to extrapolate that to critical social justice, feel free.
Sure, yeah, they're two different things. Just social justice, lowercase s and j, versus critical social justice, the ideology, postmodern critical theory ideology. But just regular social justice, critical social justice, this postmodern stuff, does not own the idea or value of social justice, justice in general. I tried to come at it from a more liberal approach, and the core of liberal methods of solving issues, really anything, including social justice, is to be willing to talk with people, subjecting your ideas to public criticism. And through that process, over time, slowly, we have progress, both knowledge and moral. So it just takes time. And, that's how it worked with civil rights. And a big part of that is not appealing to like medium-sized groups and identities. You either want to think of terms of problems through individualism or common humanity. That's a big thing in Culling of the American Mind. I definitely agree with. So appeal to, we're all humans. We all want certain things. We want to make the world a better place. How would we go about this? Propose a solution and subject it to criticism. That's the core process.
Mm-hmm. Are there a set of questions or really important questions if one is going to be critical of the right? And I'm not sure how you define or what issues or ideologies you would categorize as being on the right, but are there a set of questions or things that we should use to be critical of the right that are sort of reliable methods?
I would probably take a lot of the advice from Peter's new book, How to Have Impossible Conversations. He just lays a lot of things out in there. I went to CPAC recently and I uploaded a video where I talked with someone about free college, and I tried to do exactly the things Peter recommends in the book. And we really just got down to what the policy is and what would change her mind, and letting her think of potential disconfirmation criteria. That's one of the core things. And just planting a seed. You can't change someone's mind in one single conversation, and you should be open to being wrong yourself. Maybe they have the right policy. Maybe they have the right idea. So it just takes an open mind and being willing to revise your belief.
Yeah.
That type of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting, so taking Trump, for example, he's such an easy person to sort of dislike or I guess idolize. I mean, some people really find him to be, sort of the second coming or some version of that. But when somebody is such an irritant, sort of by personality, I think it's one of the hardest things, and I think there's some of this as well with sort of the leftists and he can use the pejoratives, libtards or whatever, right? They can come off as so easy to dislike that the natural reaction is to discount anything that they do, Trump being the case, that anything that he does must be bad and it has to be criticized. And the reality is that he, just like anybody else, is totally fallible and imperfect, perhaps more imperfect than others, and that's certainly up for debate. But the reasonable thing is, we should all want President Trump to be as successful as possible. And the easy thing to do is to use that emotion and irrational and illiberal impulse to just criticize everything and hope that he fails. And there's some complexity and nuance in there for sure. But the better, more logical, rational piece is to recognize what's right and what's good and criticize what's not good. Certainly muddied by lots of other factors as well, but I think that's true of the left as well. I mean, there's maybe not as I guess one person. It's more of an amoeba of people that are what we're looking at as sort of the villains there. But I don't know, would you characterize yourself being more of a centrist, or do you even care to characterize yourself on a political spectrum?
I'm a liberal, I'm a progressive, and I'm a conservative, depending on the issue, I guess. Mm-hmm. But I guess that makes me a centrist, maybe, in aggregate.
Yeah. Well, Reid, it's been a fun conversation, interesting conversation. Again, the hashtag question porn struck me as sort of whimsical, but as a lover of inquiry, I enjoy the work that you're doing. I certainly think that teachers could benefit from watching and thinking through and sort of analyzing the street epistemology of you. And there's also an association. I don't know if you want to talk about the Street Epistemology International organization that you have.
That's right. Street Epistemology International. It's a new nonprofit. We started. Anthony Magnabosco is the executive director. I'm the president, and it's all about just trying to help promote street epistemology. Funding people to give talks about it. Starting educational material about it, and helping people get financial support for doing it themselves. If they want to go out in public and record conversations, we can refund you or help you out. It's what we're trying to do.
It'd be an interesting pursuit to have like a street epistemology club in our schools where they could engage in this kind of thing. Because, lots of schools have debate teams, but this is different from debate. It's dialogic and discourse. And I think that people don't engage in that. I mean, the tendency is for people to want to debate and try to win and be right. But I think you and I would agree that really we're probably better off engaging much more in that discourse and dialogic. So are there other, I know you have your YouTube channel and your Twitter and any other places. Let's get those out there so folks who are listening and are interested can find you.
Sure. I'm on all the social medias, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Twitch as well. I usually go out in public and live stream my sessions on Twitch, but right now I'm stuck inside. But in the meantime, I'll be doing interviews on YouTube, so you can check me out there, Cordial Curiosity.
Okay. Any other resources you want to share? I know you've talked about Peter's work and those books, but any other books that have really resonated with you, and especially in the area of inquiry?
Definitely Peter's latest book, How to Have Impossible Conversations, and Jonathan Haidt's A Righteous Mind would be my next favorite for sure.
Okay. All right. Well, it was good talking with you, and I appreciate the time. Hopefully teachers find it useful.
Yeah, thank you, Drew.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, TeachThought.com and WeGrowTeachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.